Yes, I know. Right. Indeed. It's actually true that publicists watch these programs routinely. We are live now. Hi, publicist. Thank you. Anyway, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. What a wonderful crowd on a hot night in Scottsdale. So glad to have you here. Thank you, virtual audience, for joining us. And tonight we have two authors whose books are we presenting, and Don Bentley, whose book sold out. Tom Clancy Flashpoint, when he was here at the end of April, is back from Austin, and he's going to be part of our program. And I will say this again, I'm really grateful to Don for commuting from Texas to Arizona in order to spend time with so many wonderful authors. So, Don and Nick Petrie, who many of you watching anyway will have read and who has been here for all of his books, recommended Bill to me and his wonderful book, The Guilty One. So, Bill, what interested you in writing? First of all, why are we in Alexandria, Virginia?
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me. I live in Arlington, Virginia, so it was kind of a cheat. I decided to just go one town over to set the scene over there. But Alexandria is a really interesting place. It is a port city. I think a lot of stuff is set in Washington D.C. But this is sort of like a sleepy little brother to Washington D.C. But if you go there, there's cobblestone streets, there's pre-colonial houses, there's gas lamps on some of the buildings, and if you squint on a foggy night, it's like you're in the 1700s or the 1800s, and it's a great place to set. I've always wanted to write like a Jack the Ripper sort of story, and this was my opportunity to set it stateside. So that's why I chose Alexandria. I love the history. I love the atmosphere. It's a really interesting place because you have power players from Washington D.C., but you also have small town folks from Alexandria. You've got the rich and the poor all colliding. It's really interesting spot.
And is suburban Washington.
That's suburban
Right.
Washington.
I used to be a librarian at the Library of Congress, and I used to spend a lot of time in Alexandria because it was a change from, the federal part of Washington, quite different over in Virginia. Yep.
I love that.
Right. So you decided why a police investigation is, because there are all sorts of different forms of crime fiction.
It's true. I had wanted to tell this Jack the Ripper story, and in my day job, I also I work for the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and I had to interact with a lot of law enforcement there. And one of the portfolios that we had in my job, I had to sort of keep an eye on active shooter events around the country. I certainly wasn't a responder or anything like that, but I had to know all about these events for a few years there, which, as you can imagine, is not a lot of fun. But I had the idea for this Jack the Ripper story, and then I wanted my main character to be the first on scene at one of these events. And my main character's name is Cal Farrell, and he is the first on scene. He's a patrol officer in Alexandria. He is the first on scene. He's dealing with a drunken disorderly. He has a vagrant in his unit when he gets the call on the radio that there is an active shooter event taking place about a mile from him, and he is the first on scene. So he goes in. He is trying to engage the shooter. He chases him into this office building where the carnage happens. He's having to go over, the wounded, and you're trained in those situations to go, go, go. You are to ignore the wounded, and that kind of runs counter to human empathy. And my main character is a very kind person, and each time he has to go over somebody, he's just sort of cursing the shooter in his head. And he finally gets to the conference room where the shooter is holed up, and he wheels in to engage the shooter, and then nothing. He doesn't remember anything about the shooter, or he doesn't remember anything about the event. He wakes up in an ambulance covered in blood, and he's told that he's a hero, but his supervisors don't quite meet his eye. And over the ensuing months, his coworkers sort of whisper "Killer Cal" behind his back. So he knows that something didn't quite happen the way that it was presented to him, and he's racked with imposter syndrome. And about 6 months after that event, he's promoted to detective, but again, he doesn't feel like he's earned it, and he is once again the first on scene to to a murder, but this time it's the first inkling that there's a serial killer operating in Alexandria, Virginia. There's a body hanging incredibly, impossibly high on a tree, and that's the first clue that something is not quite right. So that's why law enforcement. That's why Alexandria.
Got it. I think the imposter syndrome thing is really fascinating. Any of you who've served in the service would recognize how awkward it would be if you were touted as a hero, but you actually weren't, and how you would feel about that, whether you would worry about being unmasked or whether, and if your colleagues kind of scented that and, gave you a really hard time about it. But the problem is that the story, the higher ups don't want to contradict the story, right? Because so they're not willing to let him try to get to the truth of the matter.
Yeah, as you can imagine,
It would embarrass
like that
them.
is terrible and rips a community apart, and there are no bright spots. But they decided, if there's going to be a silver lining, we're going to turn this guy into a hero, and we're going to sort of parade him around fundraisers, and we're going to use him to sort of get gear for the police department. We're going to throw him at fundraisers to raise books for kindergartners or whatever, and he's just sort of going through his own post-traumatic stress syndrome, and it doesn't quite realize, oh, I don't actually have to do this. And then ultimately he realizes, I don't have to be a show pony. I want to get to work. I want to be, a workhorse and actually redeem myself and try and figure out a way to solve crimes. And when the serial killer starts operating in Alexandria, he sees this as a way, I'm going to redeem myself. But of course, there are people that are very skeptical of him, and he realizes, I really need to solve this case because there are only too many people within the department that would be happy to make him the guilty one, which is why it's called the guilty one.
It would be very hard after a traumatic event to try to work with the people you'd previously worked with. You know what this reminded me of? And he actually was a hero, so it's not about an imposter. How many of you remember Jason? Jason Enderley, I think his name was. It was tragically burned. He was in a police car, and I can't remember the circumstances, but it caught fire. And basically, he was kind of melted from here up. I saw a photo of him not too long ago. But he was a hero, but it was very hard for him. It was hard for his fellow police officers to work with him. And he was, as you say, kind of on show a lot of the time. One of the stupidest and most horrible things I ever did is you don't know what to say to somebody like that. And he came into the store to do a book event. And I can still remember, I said to him, oh, you must be Jason. And then I wanted to kill myself. I was like, I can't believe I did that. It was so awful. But, that's my point, is that it makes all of us feel awkward to be around somebody, a real hero, or somebody that has taken punishment as a hero. I mean, I'm often entertained by how all of you react to real celebrity authors. We all are sort of the same thing. Oh, I love your book. I'm your biggest fan, because nobody knows what to say in the face of celebrity. We see it all the time. It's really, a common reaction is that we all go slightly stupid in
That's
moments
why I
like that.
go out of my way never to pay Don any compliments. I don't.
I saw Don looking at me wondering when I was going to go stupid.
I don't need him getting a big head on me.
I have my back to you. Sorry, I'm not including you in that. No, but really, I mean, it's a very human reaction. The way that this cop who can't remember in the book what happened, and is forced to play a role. I thought. Anyway, that's about all we can tell you. It's in Alexandria. There's a really remarkable guy, and he has to sort of thread his way. In a great thriller, you always want to have conflict, and how many different ways you can create conflict. And anytime you're in a hierarchical structure like the military or the police department or whatever, you can always have conflict in the ranks, right? And then, so that's really catnip for thriller writers, is to have somebody in government or in a police department or in the army or whatever it might be. Or you can have competing agencies. It's always the local cops versus the FBI, or the CIA versus the FBI, or whatever, because that creates a whole different set of conflicts, as well as the story conflict that you're talking about.
I wanted to keep it internal and sort of political, because the mayor and the city apparatus, it is in their best interests to just sort of sweep the story under the rug and keep it going. And they're like, just shut up and play your role. But he really bristles at that role and just wants to solve crimes and redeem himself. But and he, he is, like I mentioned, he's kind, he's empathetic. He is the kind of cop or detective that you would want if you had an issue and called 911. You would want that guy or girl to come to your rescue. And I wanted to sort of avoid the trope of, all right, well, he's a cop and he's haunted and he's going to disappear into a bottle and act out. I wanted him to be mindful of those things. I wanted him to be very proactive. He goes and he spends time with the counselor. He's doing therapy. He's got a great relationship with the police psychologist, but he still can't outrun what's chasing him.
Do you see the video of the two police? I'm trying to remember. There have been, unfortunately, so many active shooters, but the two that followed, that went into the building, was it Memphis? Where was it, Don? Nashville, right. And, that go, go, go thing that you're talking about, those guys, they did exactly that.
After Columbine, during Columbine, everybody sort of set up and set a perimeter, because that was sort of the operating orders back in the day. But since Columbine, it is, you go, go, go. It is, you do not wait. You do not wait for backup. You do not stop for the wounded. You just keep going, and your objective is to neutralize the shooter. And that runs counter, and that takes a psychic toll, obviously, in real life. But I wanted to make sure that I included that and at least represented that realistically and respectfully, that, every body you're having to leap over, it's like a psychic cut on your soul.
Well, it's a terrific book, and I'm really hoping that I will get to read a sequel. I'm going to turn this over to Don and Mike, but I was thinking when launching James Patterson a week ago, Monday, he is also writing in the Alex Cross series, a Washington police series, like you're doing.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things he said that has really resonated with me, he said basically all novels are political. And I've thought about that. What does political mean? There's so many different ways that you can define political. But at its core, any book really should have a theme or some sort of statement that you're making as an author. It's not just, a comic book kind of a thing. So I thought about that. All novels are political. I'm going to use that as a touchstone.
I might steal that.
I'm sure Jim won't mind. Right. All right. Come on, Bill. You and I will move.
You bet.
Mike, why don't you step over this way?
How y'all doing?
How you doing, Mike?
I'm good, man. Is this on?
I think so.
All right.
All right, so we're going to start with a quiz. I'm Don. He's Mike. This is his fantastic book. My first question to you, the audience, is Mike's first book was called The Handler. Who has read that book? Okay, the rest of you need to hang your head in shame. Shame. And the reason why I say that is once you've written a couple books, you get asked a lot of times to blurb books. And that's the, put your name on it and say it was a great book. And so when Mike's book, The Handler, came back, we share the same editor, and his editor, my editor, called me up and he's like, there's this incredible new author and a fantastic debut. Will you blurb it? And I'm like, yeah, that's fine. And it was maybe a Thursday. And I was like, when do you need it by? And he said, Sunday. And I'm like, oh, for the love of God. And so I get this book and I'm like, am I gonna even have time? I'll read a couple chapters. And I was locked into this sucker from the moment I read it through the entire weekend. And I told Tom, I'm like, this is the best debut that I've read in a long, long time. And so I was so excited to see Dead Drop come out because it was fantastic too. And so I'm going to put Mike on the spot and we're going to see if we can make him sweat, because I'm going to ask him the one question that all authors are absolutely terrified to answer. Are you all ready for this? Mike, what is your book about?
Yeah. Well, you sounds like you liked it. Why don't you use some? So let's see. I got that question, which everybody loves, and when I answered with the geopolitical turn of events, the interviewer on a podcast said, "That's kind of a weird answer because to me, it's really about a relationship." And I thought that's interesting because so now 2 books in the series, but it's the same protagonist across both, and that protagonist is really a couple. It's a divorced couple where the wife is active in the CIA as a reasonably senior executive, and the husband was in the special activities division and wants nothing to do with it anymore, but keeps getting pulled back in. And the theme is really that they need each other, but they don't know they need each other, and they try very, very hard to not need each other. Then on the geopolitical side, it has to do with Iran and the acquisition of nuclear weapons and preventing that.
So just so I understand, the answer you gave me for my first question is an answer somebody else gave you about your book? That's what you're... Okay,
Well,
I appreciate that. We can only go up from here.
We stand on the
is
shoulders
what-
of giants, don't we? Yeah.
So one of the things that's really unique about Mike's fantastic book, and you just touched on it, is you really have 2 protagonists. And that's super hard to do because what it does is it dilutes the reader's interest. They have to be involved with 2 different characters. So, no.
You want me to swatch them? All right.
Somebody get that chair out of here. He's a big man and he needs a bigger chair.
That wasn't the least bit awkward. So we'll just keep rolling.
This is going to be an interview talked about for eons and
For
poison
all the
pen.
right reasons. Okay.
So why 2 protagonists? Why did you decide to do that?
I didn't know what I was doing. is the first answer, and I wanted to. I realized pretty quickly as I started writing that the only way to tell the reader, your audience, what's happening, the most entertaining way to do it is through dialogue. Mm-hmm. So everybody needs a sidekick, so they can go, well, what happens if we don't get there in time, right? Mm-hmm. And the other guy says, oh my God, the world will blow up, right? Because you can't explain that as a narrator. It's just not interesting. So it has to be sort of like a screenplay. So I realized I needed to have 2 people that could kind of talk about it. That was one thing. The second thing is anytime you have dialogue, you really want there to be conflict. Otherwise, it's boring if they're just sitting there saying, how was your bagel? Freaking amazing. How are you? Have a good day. Right? It gets dull fast. So I wanted them kind of fighting and and sniping at each other, which divorced people do. And it was also a vehicle to have one person who was like a pipe hitter, kicking indoors, while you had another perspective that was in headquarters.
Yeah, and so you said something that I was going to ask next, and about conflict. And so our mutual friend Nick Petrie, whose first book is called The Drifter, I think he also moonlights as a psychologist for writers, and we call him up and ask him questions. And one of the things Nick said to me is that conflict drives books. And so what works so well with your 2 characters is there's layers of conflict in there. And so the first you talked about is that they're married and not married anymore, but maybe sort of like each other. There are a couple other layers of conflict between the 2 of them and their shared history. And can you elaborate a little more on that?
Well, in this book, I tried to explore that relationship to think, okay, if you really were, first off, having spoken to a number of people, in this business, having read memoirs, et cetera, there are quite a few CIA people who are married to each other. And it's a cloistered environment, and a lot of those marriages fail. And the reason a lot of them fail is because both spouses are doing things that they can't share with the other. And so there's this betrayal of trust. Yep. And so I wanted to play with the idea in Dead Drop that could carry over into a personal life, but it was also professional, and that the lines got very, very blurry, where they got confused about each other's history. They still needed each other for what happens in the book, but there's also this conflict about their history, and is it a personal relationship issue, or was it a professional issue?
Yeah, and so you're not giving yourself enough credit right now because you sound like they just sit at opposite cubicles and sometimes they argue about where to go for lunch. And so tell a little bit more. Like, your first book is called The Handler. What is a handler, and why is that word important with these two people?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a pun, but in the spy world and in the espionage world, you have case officers who work for the CIA, or also called operations officer, and those are like badged employees, and their job is to go and recruit agents who are foreigners, generally speaking, but have access to information. And so then the case officer handles an agent, and you call that a handler. And so in the first book, because the ex-husband has unique knowledge, he is pulled back in to have to do something, and the person that has to handle him, because it's the only one that he'll actually trust, is his ex-wife. So she de facto becomes his handler, but she also has to handle all his stupid ideas and, impulsiveness, etc.
Yeah, so I don't
as
know.
women do.
I don't know about y'all, but my wife and I can't put together a piece of IKEA furniture. So the idea that you have an ex-wife handling her ex-husband, who is the pipe hitter, is pretty fascinating. The underpinning for this entire book, kind of the conflict, is what I call the Iranian problem. And so can you lay that out a little bit and then talk about how it's featured in your book?
Yeah, and this is something in my background in the Navy. I was in the Pacific Theater, and then you end up in the Persian Gulf. So you spend an awful lot of time thinking about Iran and planning on the Iran problem and making contingency plans and war game exercises, etc. So I was a little bit obsessed with Iran when I wrote the first book. And probably most of you hear about, the Iran deal in 2015 that the Obama administration did, called the JCPOA. And all of it, we talk a lot about, we want to prevent Iran from enriching nuclear weapons, getting it to 90% for uranium-235. And now Iran's actually at a place where it's believed they can do that within a month. And so I was playing with the idea a year ago when I finished this book that, hey, by the time this hits the streets, I think Iran will have done it. I think they will be there at what the intelligence community calls breakout. And so in Dead Drop, what I wanted to show was not only the conflict between my protagonists, but the conflict between Israel and the U.S. on how to handle that. And in the book, Israel's much more aggressive about it, as one might expect. And the U.S. is shifting to a strategy of containment, which is, if you think about how we handled North Korea, we can't do anything about the fact that they have nuclear weapons. And so it's really all about containment. So there are those that disagree with that on the Israeli side, and it led me into a lot of research on Mossad and the Israeli Defense Force, et cetera. So that was the root of it.
Yeah, so that's where I'm going next. In a really great book, what happens in a really great thriller is that there are conflicts piled on top of conflicts where you're like, oh my gosh, how are they going to work their way out? And then there's something else that hits you and something else that hits you. And Mike does such a good job with that. And one of the ways that you do it is unexpected. And so I'm going to give you a quote, and I want you to react to this quote and talk about why it pertains to your book. And the quote is, "Nations have no allies, only shared interests."
Yeah, and so I was trying to portray in that the Israeli point of view, where there's some hardcore Israelis that just absolutely believe they need to act and, everything else be damned. And I wanted to not have the Israeli side be monolithic, where everybody agrees and Mossad is magical and they'll go in and just take care of this. I wanted them to really debate what does it mean to do something around preemption. And there's the characters within the Mossad that I have kind of fall on different sides of the fence and that. And I found that was true in Israel in general, and all the people that I interviewed and the research that I did. And sort of the two ends of the spectrum is there's something from the Talmud sort of a tenet, a famous passage that says, when a man is coming to kill you, you rise and kill him first. And there are those in the Israeli Defense Force, that's their dictum. They absolutely believe that. They have these things called red pages. You hear about assassinations of Iranians all the time, and that's really that very much of that doctrine. But there's this whole other side of Israeli society that believes that that they've been too aggressive and that they've almost caused some of these escalations themselves. And I really wanted to just show those gray areas that these are people. These are not just big faceless intelligence agencies. These are people having debates.
And what I thought was really interesting about that, I thought you depicted it really well. Before I wrote full time, I worked for a number of Israeli defense companies, and there is that divide within the society. There's also that divide between the U.S. and Israel, even though you have two allies. And so my Israeli boss once told me that when an American says no, he means no. When an Israeli says no, he means maybe. And so you see that a lot in the relationship. And so talk about, in your book, I don't want to give it away, you press Israeli-U.S. relationships in a way that is kind of off the charts, but there is some historical things to point to that says not all has been roses between our two countries. So talk a little about that.
Sure, and there have been a lot of roses. There have been a lot of joint successes that are public. Maybe some of you remember in 1983, Hezbollah, who's sort of a villain in the book, they bombed the U.S. Marine barracks in Lebanon. Israel, Mossad, and the CIA cooperated and assassinated, basically took out the guy that did that. His name was Mugnia, and he was in Syria, and it was right out of a book. I mean, they planted a bomb in his spare tire cover and got him, and that was a joint operation. So they do things like that a lot. Another famous one is Stuxnet, where Mossad and the CIA worked together to create code that made the centrifuges spin so fast that they all blew up. Right. So definitely worked together a lot. At the same time, in the 80s, might have been the late 70s, there was a naval intelligence analyst who was convicted of spying for Israel, named Jonathan Pollard, who spent, I think, most of the rest of his life in jail. I think the Israelis were recently actually lobbying for a pardon for him. There was also a ship in the Eastern Mediterranean that was an American intelligence gathering ship that the Israelis bombed and actually dropped bombs on this thing and tried to sink it. So all is not always roses, and that does get back to that nations have interests.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And so obviously you talk about this from a perspective, I think, that goes beyond just research you did for the book. You kind of alluded to your background a little bit earlier. Can you talk about your background in more detail and kind of how it lends itself to this book series?
Yeah. Well, I went to the University of Arizona. Really? Come on, people. And I was a Navy ROTC student, and when I graduated, I was all set to go be a jet pilot, and they said, you're going to be an intelligence officer, and I said, what's that? And they said, well, here's what it is. And so I went off and I was an intelligence officer, and I spent my entire career in the Pacific side of things, and eventually worked for what's called U.S. Pacific Command, which is based in Hawaii. And they gave me, here's this guy that always wanted to write, thrillers. And they give me this job of writing war games for the whole, Pacific theater. And so I had to come up with these things. They'd be like, come up with a disaster. I'd be like, okay, cholera in Bangladesh. Yeah, good. Just go with that, right? Okay. Somalia, something happens, and I would have to come up with these ideas, and they said the more challenging, the better. I'd be like, all right, Pakistan and India, it's the Hindu Kush. We can't even fly into there. It's too high for the helicopters, and they'd be like, bastard, and so I quite enjoyed that job, and you had to create all the message traffic and really populate it. And I had these three guys who worked for me who must have thought what's your deal, dude? What are you? And so anyway, that job was a lot of fun. And before that, as I mentioned, actually deployed, we spent all our time thinking about the Middle East, because at that time period, that's what you did, associated with aircraft carriers and strike aircraft.
So The Handler was your first book. Can you talk about a little your path to that? Were there books before it? How did that come about?
A couple failed attempts, well, they weren't really failures in that I never really did anything with them. But I was always interested in this, and I tried historical fiction, and I realized the audience for what I was writing was 150 to maybe 200 people. Then I tried to do a satire of tech, which I still think was amazing. I actually lost the file; it's gone. But this was the first time I'd ever tried to write, like a spy thriller.
And so now you're at the Poison Pen, which means you have made it officially as a writer.
And we'll check with Barbara later. Yeah.
Yeah, you can clap for that. So what is next for you? What are you working on now? What's next?
Well, there is a third book in this series that will come out next summer, so that's exciting. And
Does that have a title yet?
It does. It's called Fade to Black.
Fade to Black.
And,
you heard it here first.
Yes, and it does not focus on Iran. It's more in the Pacific. And I also recently, nearly completed a standalone book that is more of a say global military situation, so less spy and more like war.
Okay, so now it is time for you guys to pin Mike to the wall. And so we're going to open it up for questions. I have to bribe you 3 books that I will give to the first 3 people. If you don't like the book, what my wife does is turns it like this and puts her pottery on top of it, and you can do that too. So let's have some questions for Mike or Bill. Yes.
Well, I'm that's a complicated question. No, it's okay. So I met my now ex-wife in the military, and she was
your handler?
She was my handler, and we just couldn't get along. And so I knew something about that professional relationship within that kind of organization. And then I knew what it was like when that relationship wasn't as good. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it helped me to say it out loud. Yeah. But there was no strain on my family or friends or anything like that. Everyone's always very supportive. I mean, Don is very, very humble, but Don himself is a combat veteran and served in Afghanistan. And so how would you answer that question? Was there a big strain for you?
What was the question?
He's asking if when you were deployed, was it a big strain on your personal relationships?
It's kind of double-edged sword because most people can't wait to deploy. It's what you practice your entire career for to go do. And I deployed in 2005 to Afghanistan. And so by then there was more of a infrastructure, and that was kind of hard too, because I could talk to my wife fairly regularly. But what was hard about it is there were times where when I was on a QRF mission, you'd have a radio, and basically if the radio went off, you had to be airborne within 30 minutes and deal with whatever. And so there'd be times where I'd be on the phone with her and the radio would go off and I'd have to say bye. And so she knew I was going to go do something and wouldn't know that, obviously, if that hadn't existed. On a more serious note, the thing that we were all desperately afraid of is that we would have a casualty and the spouse or family would find out over social media from somebody there. And so that was another thing, is like, how do we have like a kill switch that we can knock off all the internet, all the phones, something like that, so that, God forbid somebody doesn't learn on Facebook that their loved one was just killed in Afghanistan. And so it was certainly different. Being away from your family's hard, but yeah, it was different. What else? Yes, sir.
What do you guys foresee as the most potential dangerous site in the world?
China, 100%. a few years ago, the U.S. Navy was the largest Navy combat force in the world. China equalized that, and it was around 200 ships. In the next 5 years to 10 years, we're actually going to go down net a couple ships. They're going to double, and the implications on that are enormous, largely because the way that our modern world works and is so wired up in terms of supply chain and semiconductors and everything else. It all comes from Asia, and everything that comes from Asia goes through the Malacca Straits off of Singapore, and controlling those sea lines of communications is a very big deal. And China is lining up to try to do that. It's and it starts with Taiwan, where a lot of the chips are made. And so, if from the Chinese perspective, you can see why they would want to do that. And as the U.S. Relinquishes its basing architecture in that half of the world and slims down its defense spending, I'm super worried about that. So I think that's the biggest threat.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's a great bipartisan select committee on China right now that Congressman Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin chairs, but it's had a number of recommendations and things that have come out of it. And so they, as part of it, Congressman Gallagher brought in a company to run a war game for the members of Congress so they could see it. And the war game was the invasion of the Chinese, of the Taiwan, of mainland Taiwan, and it was pretty horrific. And there's a saying that quantity is a quality all of its own. And so while we have a strategic overmatch with the Chinese Communist Party, they are fielding so many ships and so many weapons so fast that during the war game, we ran out of all of our precision guided weapons within the first week. And so what you see now, like even some of the weapons that we're giving Ukraine or selling to Ukraine, they have such long lead times, like a Javelin missile. The lead times for the components and stuff can be up to 12 or 18 months to be able to replace that. And so if you're, from my perspective, one of the lessons, and you chime in, that you learn from Ukraine is it is a whole lot easier to deter by arming your friends now than trying to figure that out after an invasion has already occurred. And that's what that war game. But if y'all are interested in that, like I said, it's a bipartisan committee, and what they come out with has been pretty incredible. They go everything from what's happening with TikTok, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to infiltrate American universities. That is very well done, and it's for the most part politics free. It's a bipartisan committee. Yep.
Mike, welcome back.
Hey, Chuck.
Very excited and happy for you. So I have two questions. One of them is legit. I've been thinking about this one for about a week. The section is not so legit. Which one do you want?
Neither? Whatever you I don't know. Let's go with legit first. Let's go with legit.
Legit. So as a relatively new professional rookie author who's hit the big, what's the thing that stands out that is the biggest unexpected event or occurrence?
I think how much. Well, let's see. There's a couple things. One is the delay and how slowly things move. So the handler I wrote in 2020, mid 2020, and so then it takes a while to get the deal done, and then there's like a year, and in that year you're like, come on, can't we? They're like, no, we'll be back to you soon, and soon is like 8 months, and then they show up and say, here's the edits you want to make, and in the meantime, you're off writing your next book. So one of the peculiar things is that you're always kind of talking. The book that's launching is always one you've written a while ago, and you're sort of now into your next thing, and so that's been surprising to me. What was the illegitimate one, or dare I ask?
So, would you say that your older brother, Bob Woodward, had a significant influence on your writing style?
Well, my older brother's here. His name's John. There was somewhere back. There he is. No, so no relation to Bob Woodward. But I read. I'm a big fan of Bob Woodward books and read many of particularly the one. One of my favorites is one of his. It's kind of obscure now, but it's called Veil, and it's about the CIA's secret wars in the like 80s. And I actually learned a lot, quite a bit from that book, and have a lot of respect for him. But no relation.
So let's do one more for Mike, and then I've got a question or two for Bill, too. Actually, we'll do two more since you all both raised your hands. Yes, ma'am.
Run ideas by where you do that. Because I don't really come up with all this stuff that's
I think you do that with the people that are really close to you. My girlfriend's in the audience here, and she helps me with that quite a bit. For example, I don't think other authors like, it's not like we collaborate, but if you say mentor, I would, Don's been a mentor for me in this process. And a little story on that. When so all this stuff started happening, and I got a ping on LinkedIn, or I think I pinged you on LinkedIn, and you accepted it. And I was like, oh, Don Bentley accepted my LinkedIn request. And I'm like, hey man, I know you don't know me, but would you be willing? And he came back and he said, I'm a fan. And you told me that whole story about Blurb. And I'm like, do you mind getting on the phone? And then you told me everything. Like I was horrified. Right. And, I'm like, and first you scared the crap out of me, because you're like, look, dude, anybody can write one book. It's that second one that really matters. I'm like, come on, dude, come on, man. And I remember you saying not to put any more pressure on you. And then you were like, and you need to finish that thing before the first one comes out, or that bit of advice. And then I was like, but I don't, like, do I call Tom? Because we have the same editor. I'm like scared of him, man. I don't know. Do I talk to him? What do I do? You're like, no, you never talk to him. You like, if you call him up and give him a plot idea, he's gonna the whole thing's gonna fall apart. Then you're like, my wife thinks I'm nuts, and he texted me this picture of his index cards of like how he organized the whole thing. I'm like, Jesus, he's Rain Man. I don't have any of that, And so I was very intimidated, but it was so helpful. And I remember it's so stupid. I go, I don't know when the second book's due. And you go, well, you have a due date. I'm like, I do? He's like, haven't you read the contract? I'm like, no, I just signed it. So I'm like, I looked at it, it was like February. It was due July 15th. I'm like, oh my God, I have so much time. All right. But yeah, so he's been a mentor to me. All right. You got to hit the big guy back there. Yeah, that's a good question. There are so many good memoirs, like when you start going, geez, I think I'm going to get serious about this, and you actually start doing research and spending time on it, you realize, wow, there's so much laying around out there that you can read, that you can just read about. And so you can read memoirs, articles, all this kind of stuff. And I had a business career that was close to technology, so it's not too hard for me to understand it. And then having an intelligence background at least gives me enough knowledge to make it dangerous. So you can kind of put that stuff together with research. But then the key is dramatizing it, right? It can't work particularly well. You can't over-explain it. All those kinds of things.
All right, so we're going to jump back to Bill real quick here, and because I have a question or two for you. So you did something that was very brave and could have potentially gone off the rails, in that you included a mass shooter event as a critical point of your book. And so I think in a great book, especially crime fiction, I think crime fiction more than any other genre, part of the purpose of it is to make you look inside yourself and say, okay, I see this thing here. How does that resonate with me? And so when you got the idea to make that a central part, how did you walk that line where it didn't feel like you were preaching at anybody, where it didn't feel like you were turning readers off instead of drawing them in? Like, how did you pull that together for your book?
Yeah, it's a sticky topic, and it's not something that I took lightly. And what I just tried to do was not look at it from a huge political lens, but you are really inside this character's head the entire time. So I wanted to make it as immediate as possible, and what a normal person would go through in this situation, what he would feel, and he'd be sweating through his uniform and all of that. And my main character is a normal police officer. He is not Jack Reacher. He is not a total badass. He is at a 7-Eleven arresting a drunken, disorderly person, and gets him to stand down by offering to buy him an ice cream cone when the call comes in. So I wanted him to be kind. I didn't want him to be like a real badass door kicker, but suddenly he is thrust into that position, and he is thrust into that situation, and he just has to follow his training. But yeah, I took it really seriously. It was it's not the lightest subject matter, but I found it fascinating, and it was just something that I kind of wanted to work out on the page.
And so y'all probably won't know this, but Bill's first couple books, his first book is called The Beast of Barcroft. It's phenomenal. It's on Kindle, and it is more of like if you were me and a kid that grew up in the 80s and saw kind of the not it's sort of horror, but kind of the creepy-esque things that you would watch when your mom and dad wouldn't know. Like, this is fantastic, and you will love this. But it is markedly different from this book. And so talk a little bit about why a police procedural? Why did you decide to write crime fiction?
I mean, I'd always just wanted to try my take on a detective story and like a modern day Jack the Ripper. And I wrote that urban fantasy trilogy, and maybe I would have kept going, but everybody said horror's really hard, and then Stranger Things came out a year afterwards. I'm like, damn it, I am always 5 minutes too late to the party. But I would counter that this is actually more frightening than any mythological creature I could have dreamt up.
Yeah, and so Barbara alluded to the fact that there is a fantastic twist in this book, and I didn't see it coming either. And when you write for a living, you're pretty good at spotting where things are going to go. And for the amount of books that you've read, to be able to surprise Barbara is pretty fantastic too, because I don't imagine there are too many at this point that you don't see coming. And so did that happen organically? Is it something you knew going in? Is it something in subsequent drafts, or how did that come about?
That I kind of knew going in. That was how it was gonna play out, and then it's just throwing as much misdirection at you as possible. But I knew that one going in.
And so then my final one for you is you were deliberately misleading on your job title. Bill is actually he investigates aliens. That's what he does. No, he has a pretty cool job for the government, but not one that necessarily lent itself to this book. And so what did you do from a research standpoint to write this?
So I work for, again, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. It's the newest agency within the Department of Homeland Security, and I work primarily with the private sector and critical infrastructure, and helping, things like critical manufacturing plants and chemical plants and shopping malls be more aware of their vulnerabilities and mitigate their risks. And part of my portfolio for a few years was the active shooter stuff. And because I had to deal with that for 5 years, that was a lot of that knowledge was ready at hand. The law enforcement stuff I had to research quite a bit, but I was in the Coast Guard too. That really didn't play too much into it. And for the record, the Coast Guard deployments were not a strain, because, we're going out, we're turning back around again. Okay, so it was really not that difficult.
This is the whole new branch of military fiction, is cybersecurity and so forth. And interesting enough, Ruth Ware's new book is about a pair who have a company, and they test cybersecurity and other security by breaking into buildings and doing a kind of whole, urban explorer thing, but pointing out what all the holes in the security thing are. So you've actually got professional knowledge and great field there.
Hey, all right.
I love that.
Let's do it.
That sounds a little like the James Patterson book that you
So-
wrote with. So talk about that real quick.
I did a novella with James Patterson that was released about 5 weeks before the Guilty one came out, but it had been written with James about 3 years before, and he's too busy writing with Dolly Parton and Bill Clinton. So the Bill Schweigart
know,
collab was,
he's upped his game, right?
it took a little while in the pipeline, but that was the novella. It was about a family who they assess risk, and they are professional risk analysts that do that. But yeah, that one's called Women and Children First, and it was fun.
So for those of you who asked about, or you were talking a little bit about your path to publishing, I have to tell you that it's speeded up and slowed down. And what used to happen way back when I started is that books came out very quickly. There wasn't a lot of preparation to them. And a second novel could be truly terrifying because you can take your whole life to write your first novel, right? I mean, nobody knows you're doing it, and nobody's going to give you a hard time if you're late or whatever it is. And then once you go into print, there's this expectation, and it used to be so immediate. I won't name who the author is, but a very famous story. An author who had such a smash hit and was so unprepared actually stole the plot, in answer to your question, for the next book from an open case in a state, and ended up being sued by the family of the pair of kids that were involved in that, and the author and the publisher had to pay up. And so the time lapse that you've now got is actually in your favor, in that you can write a second novel while the first one's cruising around waiting for people like me to be told that we should read it. Because that's a huge part of what happens, is that while Mike's book and Don's book and all is waiting, the publishers are going out to talk to people like me to say, you should read it and try to interest other people in it. Because really, booksellers are influencers. We're not on TikTok. I'm just too old for TikTok. I'm not doing the silly dance thing, but really, that's what we are. We're influencers. We're here to tell you what we think about a book. So I like the fact that the process is slowed down, although I can imagine that it is sort of irritating.
Well, you're irritating strong. The question I had gotten was like, what was most surprising? That was surprising to me. But I also, the part of that too is how much time you spend doing stuff like this, promoting it and doing social media and stuff. It's like this whole other job.
But that's the other shift, is
Yeah.
it used to be the publishers did all that work,
Right.
and now they've shifted it almost entirely to authors. Social media has totally transformed the way this whole system works.
Yeah.
And, it'll be interesting to see how much
I'm so good at it too. Just
many of us are not really good at it.
They
but, you know,
say the military is hurry up and wait. I think publishing is wait, then hurry up.
yeah, kind of like that.
that's fair.
Well, anyway, thank you very much, guys. It's been a wonderful program. Let's give them a round of applause. And it has always been our habit to give away a book to thank all of you for coming. And usually it's an advanced reading copy. I get books in paperback form months before they come out so I can read them. But I thought tonight, since I really like you to meet Bill and read his book, I would give away a copy of The Guilty One. But now I'm wondering, did we actually give out numbers, Patrick? Do we? So do you guys have numbers? Those of you who bought a book, you should have a real number in it. Right. Well, see, if you'd bought a book, you'd have a chance to win. Right. Yep, that's it. How many? Oh, okay. Well, that's not going to be enough to, but nevertheless, Bill, pick a number between 1 and 6.
4.
All right. You it's you. Wonderful. Well, here you are, right there in the front row, and you can get Bill to sign it for you. So thank you so much for coming. The authors probably will do best to stay here because it's too, yeah, right. So they'll sit up here, and you're welcome to come up and get your book signed and take a photo and whatever else.